mind. The Lowell Institute Cooperative Broadcasting Council presents John C. Sheehan, the research scientist as creator. Essay number 9 in the National Association of Educational Broadcasters series, The Creative Mind, produced by WGBH-FM in Boston under a grant from the Educational Television and Radio Center. These conversations explore the creative process as it pertains to the American artist and scientist in the 20th century. And here is our host and commentator for The Creative Mind, Lyman Bryson.
Our conversation with Mr. Sheehan, the research scientist, I suppose one might call him an applied scientist in the sense that in his work he tries to solve problems of a practical nature in medicine with the application of scientific theories, scientific discoveries that have been made by other men. This doesn't limit his work, but this is what he has done most notably. He raises a moral question more profoundly than any other thinker has done. We tend to blame the people who are at the end of a process. We tend to say that the men who made the atom bomb are responsible for all the destructive menace that there is in that, forgetting that they were only the last people in a long line of investigators who discovered nuclear fission and the structure of matter and so on and made this possible. We blame the last man. Now, of course, at the same time, we credit the last man, too. We tend to give all the credit for polio vaccine to Dr. Salk, although he himself has protested against this, forgetting the long line of men and women investigators who made what he did possible. This is partly because of the limits of our understanding on scientific work, but it's also a sign of a greater interest in the tangible and practical aspects of science. A friend of mine who collects sidewalk and cab drivers' philosophy at the time that the atom bomb was first announced, asked a driver in New York what he thought now of professors. And the driver said, oh, well, these were the working professors, not the talking professors. Now, Mr. Sheehan is a working professor in the sense that he tackles problems. The great problem of the synthesis of penicillin was one of the things to which he contributed a large part of the success. And he looks at this problem from the standpoint of somebody who is working on, well, he's trying to answer problems of how to do something rather than problems of how to know something. So perhaps the rough judgment that we make is one that he wouldn't object to. He raises the question himself that I've just been talking about, only in a slightly different form. He's asked what's the responsibility to society of the scientist, and he replies the responsibility of a scientist is to his science. The responsibility of a scientist is to find out the truth and let the chips fall where they may. I wouldn't be one to argue that point against Mr. Sheehan. Science couldn't be much use to mankind unless its workers were free to be loyal to their own ideal of truth. But I think this depends on a strong faith that all knowledge is in the long run good for us, a faith that I share. A belief that if man extends his knowledge of the nature of the world and of himself, in the long run, it will be a better world and he will be a better man. Now, not everybody in the world believes that. There are those in places of power now, as there always have been, who think that the truth ought to be ladled out in discreet spoonfuls to the trusting public by those in authority. In a free, self-governing country like ours, we all have a right to an opinion on that point. Mr. Sheehan also raises the question as to what we mean by the very carelessly used term, the scientific method. He implies that there is a certain attitude of mind, he agrees with other scientists in this, a certain combination of character and skill and training which enables the scientist to do his creative work. And he points out that this kind of work is a continuum from the most theoretical to the most practical. The theoretical scientist finds an answer to a question of knowing. The applied scientist, if we can use that term in connection with Mr. Sheehan, finds the answer to a question of doing, but they both work by the same method. It doesn't make much difference, I suppose, how this method is defined, as long as we realize that in the opinion of most scientists, the way of working is more important than the amount of knowledge. It may even be better sometimes for an experimenter not to know what other people have done, although this is rather unusual. Generally, he can be saved a good deal of false motion and duplication by knowing about the work of his predecessors and his competitors. But he must know how to work, and this is important in the thinking that we've been doing about the creative mind, because how to work is something that can, in a measure, be taught. Now, no teaching can give a young person a good mind, a firm memory, capacity to manage symbols, but you can teach habits of industry, you can train alertness, and ways of working can be explicitly taught. This is immensely important in a civilization like ours, because if it isn't true, if you can't teach how to work in science, then all of our present agitation about improving our education along the lines of scientific investigation and technological improvement are just a futility. Scientists have to be born, of course, but also they have to be made, and they can be. Now, scientific thinkers disagree somewhat among themselves as to the extent to which an individual personality can be expressed in their kind of work. Mr. Sheehan is quite firm about this. He thinks that there is an art of physics, just as in his own field. There's an art of organic chemistry, meaning that the touch of the master can be seen in the work, no matter whether it be art or science. But there's not much danger that any person will ever exploit himself too much in science, because not only is it impersonal in its nature, in its kind of truth, but also the scientist tends to be a little frightened by what he sees. Like Pascal, he's frightened by the vastness of space, even though, as in the case of Harlow Shapley, he's one of those who has led us furthest with the surest step into space. Or he may be frightened by the littlenesses of things, which is where Mr. Sheehan works, not with the infinitely vast, but with the infinitely small bits of matter. Mr. Sheehan is a scientist, however, who in all these things sees a close parallel between the creative mind in science and the creative mind in art.
Yes, at least I would say that they have a good deal in common. One of the popular misconceptions is that science is simply completely logic, that all the conclusions follow inevitably from the situation, from the known data. There is a very real part in science for something from the individual scientist to be added which is not apparent or inherent in the situation. In other words, there is a considerable part for what might be called art in science, in which the individual is able to express some of his own personality, find an outlet for his artistic impulses, and this is a very much underrated role of science. For example, one may hear the opinion expressed that teaching of science should be balanced off against the teaching of so much art, humanities. And although I certainly hold to this view in part, I would like to point out that in the pursuit of science itself, especially at the higher levels, there is very much in common with what we understand the other creative arts or endeavors.
In other words, we can describe the art of organic chemistry or the art of physics.
Well, all of science, or all of human endeavor, perhaps, can be divided into two types. One, the purely logical, and the other, the art or the personality involved. The latter would call for more intuition, more imagination. The first part, in its extreme at least, could possibly be handled by a machine. The second part presumably never could.
Here's an element of creativity that seems to be common to a great many artistic creators. I wonder if it's true of scientists too. We've talked in this series to a number of artistic people who said that they felt perhaps compulsion or necessity is too strong a word, but a real urge to express the ideas that occur to them. Not just having the ideas, but having to express them. Is that true in science?
Well, again, I would say that it is true in part. One will hear of a problem that seems so fascinating that he would like to go right into the library or right into the laboratory to work on it, to contribute to it. There are some problems which, when one is in progress on them, he feels real emotional satisfaction, and particularly if he is able to achieve a certain degree of success. When one is away from the science or the laboratory for any period of time, he often feels a very real urge to get back and to contribute in some way.
Well, now here's another angle toward that same question. A number of writers have been known to say that they didn't know what they were going to write until it was written. They didn't know what the book was about until they'd written it, in that they, in the act of writing, discover something about themselves, learn something about themselves as well as expressing their ideas. Does that apply too here?
Yes, to some extent again. There certainly is an element of what might be described as self-discovery in scientific creation, certainly in the sense that when one has completed the project, he realizes that everything fits, that it has suited this problem, has suited him in every respect. And I suppose from a psychological point of view, this is a feeling of success, reinforces his own feelings and makes him feel that he has contributed something, in, not only to the world, but perhaps to himself also.
Do scientists' ideas come to him in, that ill-used and overworked word, inspiration? Flashes of inspiration, ideas suddenly pop into his mind?
Well,
or can we make a generality about that?
Yes, sometimes they do. You try to go as far as possible by purely logical thinking, but in any difficult problem, there reaches a point where one can go no further by straight logic, or at least it is not apparent how one can do so. Someone has commented that the scientist, the best scientist, must be able to reach the right conclusions on the basis of inadequate information or data. That is where this flash of inspiration might conceivably come in.
Or perhaps even intuition.
Or intuition. Something that in retrospect you can't argue was completely logical.
And yet it worked.
Yet it worked, at least in a percentage of the cases. And how high that percentage is varies with the individual and perhaps with good fortune.
Does the particular science that you work in, that you're trained in, condition the way you think? I mean, does, for example, a physicist think in different thought patterns from those that you use as an organic chemist?
Well, certainly a theoretical physicist thinks differently from an experimental organic chemist, which I like to classify myself. However, there are theoretical chemists whose thinking must be very similar to that of a theoretical physicist. And similarly, there are experimental physicists who would have a good deal in common with my own approach to the field. In other words, in all of the sciences, there are these two extreme approaches, one of purely pencil and paper, one of coordinating data, or perhaps trying to extrapolate the data a bit, and the other trying to design experiments which will uncover new principles.
And furnish new data.
And furnish new data for the theoretical people to interpret, because contrary to most impressions, the experimentalist is usually well ahead of the theoretical man.
Well, how much influence does the sort of education that you get have on your thinking process? Is it possible to stifle a thinking process so that a creative impulse which might have been there doesn't work out by restricting education?
Well, there are many who feel that an outstanding person cannot be stifled, or at least not easily, although I must confess that some educational systems make a real attempt to do this. It is probably the middle group or the middle upper group who are most responsive to the type of training which they receive. And in other words, there are many just below the first few percentiles who could contribute at a very high level if they have an excellent educational background. However, unfortunate as it may be, in many sciences there is such a elaborate background of what might be called vocabulary of terms, of generalizations which have been derived from much work previously, and this must be learned in some way, or at least the student must be exposed to it. And the real trick is to balance off these two factors, getting across the basic information, the tools, so to speak, which he will need for his trade, but not to stifle whatever creative powers he may have, and, very important, to get him through early so that he may start contributing when he is still very young.
Brings me to the next question then. Are 4 years enough to train a scientist so that he can be a creative scientist?
No, I should say that they probably are not. It's notable now that our research scientists almost always hold a doctorate degree, so this would mean a minimum of perhaps 7 years. And the first 4 years are perhaps analogous to the pre-medical course of a physician. And then the graduate school is where these creative abilities are to be brought out.
Do your ideas come to you in a scientific field as they do in some of the artistic fields in which they occur in groups that are associated? One germ of an idea will suggest another, which will suggest another, and you get this group of associated ideas.
Yes, this often happens, and one other occurrence is that sometimes all the pieces will fall together in a magical way, just as though one dumped all the pieces of a jigsaw puzzle on the floor and they all fell into the correct pattern.
Finding the keystone of the arch.
Finding the keystone of the arch, so to speak, and all of a sudden the complete synthetic route, for example, becomes clear. You've been always concerned as just what order and how one should go at it, and all of a sudden it seems to gel.
Now, for the sake of clarity, exactly what do you mean by a synthetic route?
Well, my own specialty is synthetic organic chemistry, in which we build up relatively complicated molecules, combinations of atoms, by a series of steps, consecutive steps. Sometimes there's 30 or more. And at each of these stages, there's a chance for success or failure. And one has to consider what order one shall go at these steps. For this molecule has several, sometimes 4 or 5 potentially reactive sites, and one must keep the other 4 sites out of mischief while he operates on the desired point.
I do see what you mean now. Do you ever feel an impulse to work in a particular area even when there's no specific problem in front of you? As I've heard 1 or 2 people say, who are painters, I don't know what I'm going to paint, but I feel like painting. Well, I feel an impulse to paint.
Well, one may very well start research without trying to solve any specific problem. He may, for example, have noted some experimental observation that seems not to fall into the usual generalizations, and he would just like to find out a little more about this, and perhaps a good deal more about it. And this, in some instances, these have led to major breakthroughs in science, but the person was not really trying to solve a problem in the sense he was trying to cure some disease, for example, or develop a better fabric. He was just puzzled by this seeming anomaly.
How vital is the fact that you're essentially dependent on equipment and materials and so forth? By comparison, the musician can actually compose his symphony without a musical instrument around him. He can compose in his mind. Is that possible in science, or are you more dependent on equipment and material and so forth?
Well, presumably we are more dependent than the musician is. In the past, one could contribute a great deal with very simple equipment, and this is still true in many branches of science. It has been true in the theoretical approach, but now many of the theoretical people need very elaborate calculating machines, for example.
I can imagine.
And certainly the physicists feel they're completely barren of equipment if they don't have $10 million worth of atom-smashing machines. Even the organic chemist now needs quite an array of machines to determine structure, for example. But in synthesis, relatively simple equipment still suffices. It's still something at the experimental level, has some of the aspects of craftsmanship or the art, a physical art, such as a surgeon might have, for example.
Well, let's get from the more general questions into some slightly more specific ones about your own field of synthetic organic chemistry. And the first one is a very simple question, and may seem a little naive of me, but I'll ask it anyway out of curiosity. And that is, why synthesize?
Well, I can answer for myself, and I think I'm answering for most scientists, or certainly organic chemists. First of all, for the same reason that other people like to climb high mountains. There's real adventure, challenge, or drama in tackling a problem which has offered difficulty. And it's not only a challenge at the intellectual level, but certainly also at the emotional level.
And then there are, of course, more practical reasons insofar as people who are not in the sciences are concerned.
Yes, it is true that our modern world has benefited a great deal from the synthetic organic chemist in a practical fashion. New drugs, new insecticides, new textiles, new paints, all sorts of materials.
Isn't it also true that in our century, which has seen so much of war, in which great areas of the world were cut off from normal trade, that we've been able to supply ourselves with materials we wouldn't otherwise have?
Yes, that is certainly true.
Rubber, for example.
And it is, one should point out that the synthetic organic chemist has altered the economics of the world in a very profound fashion. Well, for example, this rubber has made a considerable difference in rubber growing areas. Earlier in the past century, the synthesis of such dyes as alizarin changed the economics of India and other countries dependent upon the growing of these natural products. But the present function of the synthetic organic chemist is to create new materials and improved ones, not necessarily just to compete with nature, but to give us something which, for our own purposes, is superior.
Well, I understand that's true of your most recent accomplishment, the synthesis of penicillin. Isn't the synthetic penicillin essentially a new penicillin? Doesn't it have different qualities from the natural?
Yes, by our synthetic routes, we not only prepared one of the penicillins made by fermentation and used clinically at the present time, but the method permits the synthesis of a number of variants of the molecule, which we hope will have advantages from a medical standpoint. Already about 12 new penicillins, none of which could be prepared by the fermentation of the natural method.
And these are made possible by the synthetic process, then?
Yes, these are made possible by the synthetic methods which were developed in our laboratory.
And these new methods will perhaps treat specific illnesses, or?
Well, that is one of the hopes, that it would have a so-called broader spectrum, that it might act on certain diseases which are not sensitive to penicillin at the present time, for example, typhoid fever. Or perhaps the major contribution would be that it would work on these sophisticated microorganisms which have become resistant to the natural antibiotics.
How do you choose a research problem? What is your approach, your attitude in selecting a problem? What do you consider?
Well, in my own case, I'm now somewhat specialized as a synthetic organic chemist, so I simply cast about for molecules usually of some biological importance or some possible medical significance, which look to be interesting to make in the same sense that a certain type of mountain might be interesting to climb, or a chess problem would be interesting to solve. One has to take into account certain practical considerations. That is his laboratory properly equipped and staffed to handle a problem of that magnitude in a reasonable period of time. It's a little difficult to bring in the emotional feeling, except in certain extreme cases. In the penicillin case, I thought that problem had most everything.
Are you ever commissioned to do a particular piece of research? Do you get a request from MIT, for example, or from an outside firm to undertake a particular problem that they're interested in solving?
Well, once in a while one is approached with such a suggestion. Usually this is rejected, especially if it's directed toward a very utilitarian type of problem. The only problems which I undertake, and I think this is true for nearly everyone at major schools, are problems in which the investigator is allowed a great deal of latitude and has real scientific interest to it.
I have one more question related to scientific research, and again, it may sound like a rather naive question, but I think it's an important one. And that is, when do you stop?
Well, that is indeed a difficult problem. There are many research topics which one would like to discontinue, and if one continues too long on an unproductive line, there is, of course, a good bit of waste. As you know, the second best poker hand is the most expensive one there. If it's very poor, you'll drop out of the game very, very, very early. In the rather exceptional one, perhaps, was our penicillin project, which I felt that I was just going to stay with it, period.
There are a few general questions I'd like to ask you regarding the place of the creative scientist in his society. That is, where is the area in which the scientist feels his gravest responsibility? Is it to his society or to his science?
Well, I don't know that they're incompatible, and it's an either-or situation. I would say that the scientist's gravest responsibility is to do the best science which he knows how, to find out the truth, and even more than find out the truth, to find out the place in which he can contribute the greatest, and he simply has to let the chips fall where they may. Of course, it is true that depending upon what problem or what field one is working in, one can think that you're either benefiting or perhaps in a few cases one might argue that temporarily at least mankind may suffer just a bit from some observation. But it is very difficult for the scientist to select his problem on that basis.
Have you any prediction that you can give us as to what sort of problems you'll be working on in the future?
Well, I'll continue to work on synthesis, both development of new experimental methods. I'm particularly interested in methods which operate under very mild conditions, so-called simulated physiological syntheses, which work in aqueous systems not too different from living processes. We may try the synthesis of one or more other antibiotics, since I find this field particularly intriguing.
Are the others as difficult of solution as penicillin was?
Well, some of them are...
Or can you tell yet?
Some of them may well be very difficult, but their difficulty will be of a different type from that of penicillin. And although I could well be prejudiced on this matter, I think that the penicillin was still the most interesting of the problems which I have been acquainted with.
John C. Sheehan, the research scientist as creator. Conversation number 9 in a series exploring the creative process as it pertains to the American artist and scientist in the 20th century. Host for The Creative Mind, Lyman Bryson. Producer for the series, Jack D. Summerfield, with William Cavness and Nadja Eisenberg as production associates. Next week, Walter Piston, the composer as creator. The Creative Mind is produced and recorded by WGBH-FM in Boston for the National Association of Educational Broadcasters under a grant from the Educational Television and Radio Center. This program was distributed by the National Educational Radio Network.